Victory for Hamas. Israel's former justice minister says the group is dictating the conditions and could try to drag out the process forever. Detectives who investigated the disappearance of Nicola Bulley in Lancashire have been criticised for failing to curb speculation online. She died after falling in the River Wye earlier this year. And the King and Queen are hosting South Korea's president and his wife for dinner at Buckingham Palace tonight. It's part of a 3-day state visit. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 14 points at 74.81. The pound buys $1.25 and €1.14. LBC weather, outbreaks of rain moving southwards across Scotland as well as parts of northern England and Northern Ireland. Dry elsewhere with a low of 3. Windy tomorrow with some rain over northwest Scotland. Largely dry elsewhere with some bright spells and a high of 13 Celsius. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
And welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. It's with me, Iain Dale, and we will be taking your calls right throughout the hour, putting your questions to our panel of 4 experts. Or should I say experts? I don't know. You're all expert in your own particular fields, aren't you? We have with us Carla, co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. Ben Bradley is Conservative MP for Mansfield and leader of Nottinghamshire County Council. Ben Lake is making his debut on the programme. He's Plaid Cymru MP for Ceredigion. And Alys Denby is editor of the centre-right news commentary site CapX. 0345 6060 973. That's the number you need to speak to our panel.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first caller. It's John T. in St John's Wood. Hello, John T.
Hi, Iain. For the panel, is the Ukraine war a Putin issue or a Russia issue?
Just explain what you mean by that.
Well, as a student of history, I see Russia and this Russian political class behind Putin as being deeply resentful against the West. And if Putin goes at any point through illness or coup, it's much more likely we're going to get something actually worse. I think we have a structural problem with Russia, not just with one dictator. It's much more serious.
Alys Denby.
I wish you hadn't come to me first. I'm really not a sort of foreign affairs expert, and I think actually it's quite dangerous for sort of armchair commentators to kind of just spout off about the war when they don't know much about it. I suppose, John T., I guess I would agree with you to the extent that I don't think the idea if we remove Putin that Russia will somehow magically transform into a perfect liberal democracy. I think you could well be right that whatever follows him could be much worse, but I think, from Britain's perspective, we need to stand by our allies in Ukraine and do everything we can to help them win back their freedom.
Okay, Ben?
I think it's an interesting point, actually, that John T. made there about the history of this. And, we know that Vladimir Putin is a fan of Peter the Great and other Russian imperial monarchs who did pursue, quite an expansive foreign policy, to put it lightly and politely. And so I think we have to be aware of the history here. And in fairness, Ben Wallace, when he was Defence Secretary, made that point in an essay about a year or so before the invasion of Ukraine. But I would agree, actually, that I fear that even if Putin was to be removed either by a coup or by any other means, then we shouldn't then expect that things would suddenly return to normal. We need to hope for that and certainly try to make overtures of that regard. But ultimately, unless the Russian people want to remove Putin by whatever means, I think it would be naive to think that just getting rid of one man will solve all these problems.
Do you think the Ukraine war would have happened if there'd been a different Russian leader? Or, John T. is kind of suggesting, he either thinks it is a Putin issue or it's something endemic in Russia, that there is this, if you go, as you say, going back in history, this expansionist nature, and Putin wants to get back to sort of Soviet times in terms of the borders.
I think, if I can be quite a contrarian for a moment, I think part of the sort of contribution to emboldening Putin and some of his closest military allies was the fact that international law wasn't really enforced in the decade prior to the invasion. I do personally believe that had there been greater measures taken at an earlier date, that we may well have snuffed this sort of obsession out and to teach a lesson, really, that, you can't just go about undermining international law and taking, other sovereign nations' territory by force of arms. And I think that might have been, let's see how the history books are written, but I think that will be a big factor. And so I suppose to answer your question, I think we, by our failure to enforce international law and also, controversially, perhaps our own actions of the last 2 decades on the world stage, as the West, we might have emboldened Putin in a way that if we had stood more fastly with the rule of international law, that perhaps he wouldn't have had the opportunity or the courage to do what he did.
Carla Daniel.
Well, I think one of the things that Jonty's question underlines is why coups are rarely a good idea and that we shouldn't support them. Obviously, it's far from the only reason, but whether it's Russians or other countries going in and removing the man at the top, almost never has the outcome desired by the people doing it. And so, to me, that's a reason why you support, for example, independent journalists in a country like Russia, so that the citizens of the country can build their own way out of the situation like this.
In terms of where Britain is at the moment, it's interesting, I think, in Germany, your sister party, the Green Party in Germany, they seem to be much more hardline on Ukraine than the SPD, for example. Where do you sit on this? Are you fully behind the British government's attitude to the war and supplying weapons to Ukraine?
I do support supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine, but I do also think that the UK could perhaps be doing a bit more on the diplomatic side as well, and that's what we as Greens have been saying from the start.
Like what?
Supporting and calling for the UN to have a greater role in negotiating and brokering. This is something that's been coming up recently around Israel and Gaza as well, that people say back to me, well, you can't negotiate with these guys, but all wars, all conflicts end in negotiation. That's how you end a war. The sooner you can bring that about, the fewer deaths on all sides, and the better for everyone generally.
Okay, Ben Bradley.
Well, yeah, Ben touched on earlier on, you can't take the history out of any of these equations, can you? We know it's not just a recent thing that Russia has had an approach of wanting to return to previous geographies and the kind of power that it's had in the past. So, it can't be the case that it is just one man, and I can't imagine for a second that Putin has not planned for what happens if he's not there. But in my political lifetime, he's always been there. Relatively short political lifetime, granted. But, I couldn't speak to what Russia was like before, in my memory, to be honest. And we will see. But as Ben said, again, naive to think that it would all just go away if we got there. I do think, to the kind of second part of the question, I suppose, about the wider Ukraine issue, I do think that alliance for us, NATO really came about as a result of that expansionism and to protect Western interests from that perspective. So it's hugely important that we support our kind of Ukrainian allies. And I think you see from Cameron's visit again this week, you see the level of support and appreciation from Ukrainian people that they have for Britain in that sense.
Right, let's move on to Stephen in East Grinstead. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. Today, when questioned by the Monetary Policy Committee, the Governor of the Bank of England said, "It's our job to control inflation." Did the Governor give the PM a verbal slapdown regarding who is responsible for reducing inflation?
Was he questioned by the Treasury Select Committee? I think you said the Monetary Policy Committee, but he's a member of that, so I don't see why he would be questioned by that. But anyway, whoever he was being questioned by, you're right, he did say that. But it is a fact, isn't it, that his remit is to keep inflation to 2%. A verbal slapdown for the Prime Minister, Ben?
If you want to read into it at that level, I would like to think that would not be the intention here. But, it's one of those argue quite funny kind of political debates, isn't it? That obviously inflation goes up and the government are very keen to say it's nothing to do with them. When it comes down, we all want to take great credit for it. I mean, it's a complex myriad of factors, isn't it, that affect all of these outcomes, whether it's inflation or even interest rates and the things that they consider in making those decisions to put them up. It's a wide range of things. I think if government can take credit for anything in that equation, it's not doing anything that's made it worse, probably, and some of the actions and being sensible.
That's a pretty low bar to take credit for.
If your argument is that it's nothing to do with the government and government doesn't control inflation, then that's the lever you've got, isn't it, to manage your spending in a sensible and effective way and make sure that you don't have a negative impact, so that people like the Governor of the Bank of England can take decisions to manage it. You could easily have gone out and spent a lot of more money on a lot more things, and it would have been much more difficult to control. So I do think government has a role in that sense, but of course it's not just the government or the Prime Minister.
Do you worry about some of the announcements that we're told are coming in the autumn statement tomorrow about tax cuts? Because some tax cuts could be inflationary, couldn't they?
And I'm sure, far be it for me to speak for the Chancellor in that sense, I'm sure he will have considered a lot of that. Inflation has been the number one conversation from the Treasury, hasn't it? The number one priority. So I can't imagine he's just going to forget that in for tomorrow's announcements. But I'm pleased from a perhaps an ideological perspective. I am very, very uncomfortable with the level of taxation in this country as it stands, even if it is still lower than a lot of other Western countries. I would like to see it come down, and if he wants to cut personal taxes, particularly for low and middle earners tomorrow, then I'll be delighted with that.
Carla?
Well, I didn't hear the tone of voice, which I'm sure was key to knowing whether it was a slap down, but I certainly think he was right to remind the government that the government can't really claim quite as much credit for reducing inflation as they seem to be trying to do over the last few weeks. And it's really important to remember that inflation falling does not mean that prices are falling, because there's been some comments that have come from ministers that have made it sound like they're trying to make viewers and listeners believe that this means that they're immediately going to be better off. It doesn't. If inflation is low, it just means things are getting more expensive less quickly.
And there will be some items that probably have fallen in price. I mean, maybe a minority, and maybe some. If you look at the price of, I noticed my local petrol station, the price of petrol and diesel has come down a little bit, though it had gone up again. It depends on what the products are.
Of course, there's variability between different products, but the point is that the vast majority of people are still worse off than they were a few years ago, and the government does hold some responsibility for that. And so I'm going to be looking in the autumn statement tomorrow for policies that help out, that actually tackle the cost of living crisis or the inequality crisis, as I think it's more accurate to describe it. And I am worried about rumours of tax cuts, especially because some of the tax cuts that are rumoured will not actually help out those on the lowest incomes or even middle incomes. If we're talking about lowering income tax, that will mostly benefit the most well-off.
I don't think most people don't think that's going to happen. It might happen in the budget, but I think the prediction seems to be that national insurance will be cut.
Well, that would have a similar effect.
That would affect low earners. So if you raise the threshold for national insurance, for example.
It all depends what happens with the threshold, which we'll have
Well, we'll find out tomorrow, won't we? Alys, what do you think is going to happen, and what's your answer to the question?
Yeah, I mean, same as Carla. I didn't hear the tone of voice, but I think if you want to read in, perhaps it's a tacit admission of the Bank of England's own role in driving up inflation. The Bank of England has printed £1 trillion since 2008 in quantitative easing. That is a huge contributor to inflation. And I think the problem for the government is that there is a kind of deficit of accountability here. The government gets all the blame for economic mismanagement when it's absolutely right. The Bank of England's got a job to control inflation, and it completely failed to foresee this crisis coming. So I have some sympathy with the government here for trying to claim credit when they also will get all the blame when it's going up.
Ben Lake.
I have to say I have a lot of sympathy for that point, actually, in terms of the Bank of England. You know, if they were very keen to slap down the government, I have to say I didn't listen to the comments either. But, you know, if only somebody was in control of it, because as far as I can see it, that the Bank of England hasn't got a great track record the last year or so. And so it's rather rich, really, for them to be preaching to others. Now, yes, I agree with Ben, actually. You know, governments of all political persuasions will try to claim credit when inflation is falling and will try to dodge blame for when it's increasing. The fact of the matter is that unless you have a government that wishes to take a far more interventionist approach in terms of controlling prices, then they don't really have many levers to control inflation. They can try to avoid making it worse, and tax policies can only get you so far. So for tomorrow, I think the key thing I'd like to see from the Chancellor is what he intends to do on the thresholds, because I do agree that we really need to ensure that any tax cuts, the benefit of them really felt by those on the lower middle incomes. And I'm convinced that it's through the thresholds actually that you do that most effectively at this point in time, because I don't think we're talking about restructuring, income tax or national insurance. I think we're going to stick to the same bands, but just tinker on the thresholds. And I think that would do a lot of good for many people in my part of the world. Increasing the personal allowance or indeed the national insurance threshold would have an immediate impact.
And if David Cameron was here, Ben, he would say, well, under my government, we double the thresholds from 6,000 to 12,500. Yeah. But they haven't gone up, I think I'm right in saying, for 6 or 7 years now.
Been frozen since then.
Is that something that you'd like to see happen?
I would like to see that. I think if you look at, if you consider that freeze as what implication that has on people's take-home pay, that's quite a significant tax rise, actually, the freeze over that period of time. It is fair to say it did double in the years before that. So, perhaps over the period, it's probably been reasonably beneficial. But certainly in recent years, cost of living, inflation, all the rest of it, it will be a nice and a relatively straightforward one to do, if probably expensive. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on Alys's point, which I think is really fundamental about accountability, because one of the great frustrations I find across not just these kinds of things, but everything, is how little control the government often have over some of these decisions. We've seen it recently on whether it's on Rwanda or protests or finances and the economy. We kind of over many, many decades farm lots of things off to the independent body for this and the third-party review of that. It means that for a very centralised country, the government actually has quite a low amount of clout in a lot of decision making, but all the accountability, of course, which
and particularly the globalised economy, because if inflation in the 70s and 80s, the government had control over the Bank of England, so and therefore interest rates, but also it didn't have all of these sort of world measures that are frankly out of their hands. Carla, you wanted to come in.
Well, yeah, it's interesting talking about which taxes might be cut and what the thresholds are, but actually I'd like to lift our gaze a little bit more towards the horizon and think about the more transformative changes that we could see in the autumn statement. I don't think we're going to, but as the Greens, we would like to see a restructuring of the tax system to make it fundamentally much more fair. So, for example, something which I don't think is very much known about and is really unfair is capital gains tax. So that's the tax you pay on proceeds from assets, is lower than income tax, the tax you pay on income from work. Now, it's obviously mostly the wealthy that have lots of assets. And so that is the government choosing to tax well-off people less overall than less well-off working people. That's fundamentally unfair. And so the Greens want to see capital gains tax and income tax equalised. That would put a lot more money in the Treasurer coffers and would mean that we could have better funded public services, paying NHS workers properly. You
may want to listen tomorrow evening, because we have Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, on for an hour, well, 3/4 of an hour from 7 o'clock, reacting to the autumn statement.
Yeah,
and
unfortunately, Labour have already ruled out equalising.
Well, I was going to say, you could put her on the spot on that, but maybe I'll do it for you. How about that?
Yes, please. That would be great. I look forward to tuning in.
Right. We will take more of your questions. Lines are free, 0345 6060 973, if you'd like to put a question to our panel. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Let me reintroduce you to our panel. Carla is co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. Ben Bradley is Conservative MP for Mansfield and the leader of Nottinghamshire County Council. Ben Lake is Plaid Cymru MP for Ceredigion. And Alys Denby is editor of the centre-right news commentary site CapX. Now, Ceredigion, I think it's a wonderful name for a constituency. And your constituency, it's sort of flipped between the Liberal Democrats and Plaid Cymru over the years, hasn't it? And you're one of the younger MPs in the House of Commons. How have you found it so far?
Not too bad. So I was one of the youngest when I was elected in 2017. I think, dare I say it, there are quite a handful of them who are younger than me now. And Mary Black was always younger than me, which is frustrating. So I was never baby of the house. But no, you're right. Ceredigion's an interesting seat. It's tended to be its own little political universe for quite some time. And one of the most famous quotes that I think best describes the political traditions in Ceredigion was said by a predecessor of mine, the only Labour MP to have ever won the seat back in the 60s, Alys Morgan, and he famously told the newsreaders upon his election, I'm not that surprised that Labour has taken this seat. I'm more surprised that Ceredigion has followed the national swing, because we usually do our own things. So, an interesting place.
And for those not very familiar with Welsh geography, where is it?
So it's on the west coast, and our biggest town is Aberystwyth in the north, and then Cardigan in the south.
Right. Let's go to our next question. It's a text question from Chris in Stubbington. Is threatening to take benefits away from disabled people unless they start working from home a sign that the nasty party is back? Well, this is the second day cross question in a row that we've got a question saying, is the nasty party back? Now, the Times reports people receiving disability benefits will be asked to find work they can do from home or face having those benefits cut by £4,680 a year. Carla Denyer.
We've already got a benefit system that is pretty callous and cruel, in my opinion. It is frankly incredible in a civilised country that in order to access enough funds to eat, to put the heating on, we expect people to jump through incredibly difficult and dehumanising hoops, and I think it's bad enough as it is, and the rumours that it could get even worse is not okay. Greens, as you will know, and as some of your listeners will know, have had a policy of universal basic income since we were founded 50 years ago, and that is the radical idea that food and shelter are a basic human right, and that shouldn't be conditional on carrying out certain activities. Of course, work is a very important part of having a fulfilling life for many people, and the pilots that have already happened in various countries on a universal basic income have shown that, contrary to what people sometimes speculate, it doesn't stop people working. In fact, it helps people to find more fulfilling, more meaningful, more socially beneficial
But can
work.
you name a country that has done this experiment that has then continued with it?
There hasn't been a country that's done it at a whole countrywide level yet, but Finland and parts of Canada have done limited trials, and it's something that we as the Greens would like to see. The idea of a universal basic income, as the name suggests, it's a basic income, so it's not going to pay for all of your luxuries and hobbies and everything, but it is recognising that being able to feed yourself and your kids, heat your home and have a roof over your head is not something that you should be needing to jump through.
That's why we have a welfare state, isn't it? For people who do fall on hard times, the welfare state is there to help them back into
Indeed,
work.
that is the point that the welfare state is meant to fulfil, but I don't think it's doing that job at the moment.
Why shouldn't somebody who is disabled but is capable do work from home?
Well, they should be supported into doing so, certainly, but
isn't that the aim of this?
If I believed that this policy really was going to kind of gently and caringly support disabled people into work that they're capable of doing and that is not going to make their condition worse in the long run, then I might feel differently about it. But I think we've seen from the last 13 and a half years of this Conservative government and previous Conservative governments that's not the motivation here, and every time the conditions for people on benefits get harder, we hear in the news more and more examples of disabled people being forced through dehumanising assessment, procedures where they're, especially with many disabilities are variable, right? You're not exactly the same every single day. Some days you might be able to walk 100 metres, other days you can barely manage 10. And yet the assessments that are made for accessing these benefits don't recognise that and often penalise people for the misfortune of having a good day.
OK, but that's not an argument for not having assessments, is it? Because if you are receiving money from the taxpayer, I think the taxpayer has a reasonable assumption that you can't just claim it and automatically get it. You have to prove that you're entitled to it.
Yeah, and the Green Party would have a universal basic income that everyone would access, and then there would be additional benefits on top for people who needed it, and obviously disability benefit would be one of them.
Ben Lake.
I fear that these comments really aren't helpful from the minister, if I'm totally honest, because I can just tell you a number of examples just from my own casework where individuals who have disabilities have to jump through quite stringent hoops just to get the basic level of support through the existing benefit structure. So I think it's not helpful to convey or to imply that the benefits themselves for disabled citizens are incredibly generous and easy to get, because they're not. And I think there is a bit of a subtext here that there's a, dare I say it, implication that they don't deserve it. I can tell you that, at least from my experience as an MP, those constituents of mine who've come to me with difficulties have had to jump through incredible hoops, and as Carla said, quite dehumanising as well. I've had individuals being questioned whether or not they're still missing a limb. How on earth do you think that a limb will grow back? There are serious issues here that I think are not helped by comments by the minister. And to be honest, I don't think there's anything wrong in supporting people into work. I think that's quite a laudable aim, and I would support that. But I wouldn't use it or frame it in such a way as that if you're on disability benefits and can't work from home, then we are going to sanction you in some way. Because in rural areas like mine, most people won't be able to work from home because we haven't got broadband. So if the government's proposing a multi-billion pound infrastructure upgrade for Ceredigion to ensure that everybody has full fast fibre, great, but they're not.
See, that's what you would have got with Boris Johnson and his gigabit economy, wouldn't you, Alys?
I think the welfare state should be a safety net. It shouldn't be a perverse incentive to work less, and it shouldn't be a way of trapping people in dependency. And I do think that universal credit has actually been very successful in kind of breaking this perception people had about there being a distinction between like strivers and shirkers, because people recognise that the vast majority of people on universal credit are in work. But I agree with both what Ben and Carla have said. Well, of course, it's a good thing. It incentivises people who can work to work more, and it means you're always better off in work. I think that's very much a good thing. And I think the perception, we used to have, I remember in the noughties kind of benefit street programme, a real stigma around being on welfare. And I just don't think that applies anymore. But I do think both of you made really good points about how our state is very poor at tailoring things to individual households. We see that at both ends. We also saw how help with energy bills was going to some of the richest people in the country as well as the poorest, because it was just too difficult to figure out who needed what. So, I think with this policy, there probably will be examples of people who've had to jump through unreasonable hoops. But I don't see in principle a problem with incentivising people who can work to work more.
OK, Ben Bradley.
That's absolutely right. I think it comes from a place of stereotypes and ideology, doesn't it, to assume that because the minister says people who can work should work, that there's something callous or whatever behind that. The principle of that is fundamentally absolutely right. And there are exceptions, of course, and there are people who can't. But as a rule, if you are able to take part and contribute to the economy and have a more rewarding life because you're, going to work or doing all the social things that fit around that, then that's positive. And, having a system, as Alice says, that incentivises working the right way and supports people as well. I mean, I see the other side of the coin. I work with our local college on supported employment programmes. I've been to visit a factory recently where they're working in quite an intensive way with a lot of young people with learning disabilities who would have easily been written off and told that they can't work, and as a council we do this as well. They're being supported in the workplace to settle into a job and design a job that suits them. And we, across the public and private sector, have a duty in that as well to design and find roles that are suitable and that are flexible, not least because we need employees of all kinds, don't we? But it's not feasible to ignore the issue of trying to get more people either who are off sick or disability or whatever engaged in the workplace. When we have this huge problem with economic inactivity, we have workplace and workforce shortages across everything, and we've got millions and millions of people out of work. And we don't refer to them in unemployment figures because there are all sorts of other factors and things around that. But actually, my constituency is one of the worst in the country for economic inactivity. A lot of that is mental health. A lot of that is people who've been off on long-term sick for a variety of reasons. It's complex, and that's the point about trying to tailor it to individual needs. That never goes perfectly, and you always find things that go wrong, frustratingly and sometimes upsettingly. But the principle, I think, is spot on.
Now, Carla, I'm very surprised that you haven't mentioned something that Chris has just put on my screen. Wales is currently trialling a universal basic income for those aged 18 who left care between summer 2022 and summer 2023, giving them almost £1,300 a month after tax. Plaid Cymru has supported the introduction of it. I mean, I don't know if it's working. Any sort of...
I think it's still quite early, but the initial reports are promising. The reports back from the individuals in receipt of the basic income payment are very positive. What they're telling us is that they're finding it a lot easier now to pursue various education opportunities and also lines of work. So far, it is proving what Clara said, that many people are still looking for things to do, whether that is training or work opportunities.
Right, we'll take more of your questions in a moment. Keep your calls coming, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:33 news headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
The bodies of 4 teenagers who went missing in North Wales have been found in a car in Gwynedd. The group hadn't been seen since Sunday when they were spotted in a silver Ford Fiesta, which was found near the village of Garreg. LBC has been told an agreement to release Israeli hostages is only a victory for Hamas. Israel's former justice minister says the group is dictating the conditions and could try to drag out the process forever. And detectives who investigated the disappearance of Nicola Bulley in Lancashire have been criticised for releasing personal information about her health. A review has concluded it was avoidable and unnecessary, although decided the overall operation was well handled. LBC weather, showers moving southwards over Scotland as well as Northern Ireland and Northern England. Drier elsewhere with a low of 3.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:36 on LBC. We have with us Carla Denyer, Ben Bradley, Ben Lake and Alys Denby. Let's go to Chris in Croydon. Hello, Chris.
Oh, good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. My question is this. Is a Green Party with no population policy a misnomer?
Now, overpopulation, Carla, is a big contribution to climate change, and yet the Greens don't have a policy on it. Why?
It depends how you measure it, doesn't it? Because, yes, there is a growing population, although it's forecast to stop growing and turn around before too long. But by far, the greatest contribution to climate change comes from the very richest people, individuals, and the very richest countries. So the UK, for example, has a much higher, several times higher carbon footprint than even, rapidly developing countries like China, let alone less well-developed countries. So I have a big concern when the conversation around climate moves on to population growth, because then that is very easily becomes the thin end of the wedge of blaming people who have no responsibility for the
But if you look
crisis.
at the world population, the world population is going to grow and grow and grow. And in the end,
I think it's only forecast to grow for a couple of decades more, I think, is it?
Really?
And then it's going to turn around. I think
okay,
I think that's what I saw.
I'll take your word for that. But that there will be parts of the world, already that are overpopulated. And I think Chris raises an interesting point. But then again, what would you have in a population policy? China tried it, didn't really work there. So I think they've almost abandoned it now. If you said to the British people, well, you can only have one child or two children, I think I know what the response would be. So is that why, frankly, you haven't got a policy on it? Because you can't have a policy on it, because nobody would support it.
It's not just because nobody would support it, it's because we don't think that's the way to tackle the climate crisis. Countries like the UK and the US have large per person carbon emissions, and there's lots that governments in countries like the UK can do to lower that, and that's about, for example, providing public services. So if we had better public transport and we subsidise public transport a bit more, and driving and domestic flights a bit less, currently you'd be amazed how much those are subsidised, then we would have less per person carbon emissions because more people would be getting the train and the bus. So there are policy levers that are much more desirable because they create a fairer, greener society, a better place to live, than controlling how many people you have in your family. So it's not just what would people think. It's us pursuing good quality evidence-based policy that has multiple benefits in terms of people's well-being.
Now, as this was a question primarily aimed at Carla, want brief answers from the rest of you, or no answer at all, you can choose. Alys?
Well, I would say that if you look at growing economies, particularly places where women have more equality and better rights, then birth rates are actually in decline. I think the best way to tackle population policy is to raise living standards, to have growing economies, to have prosperity. And I think the converse of overpopulation is depopulation.
So women are too busy to have children, is that what you're saying effectively?
I think for women to have, for being a mother not to be a woman's only or best option, and if you look at countries where that's the case, then they're choosing to have fewer children. So I think growth, equality, innovation is the answer to this. Frankly, depopulation sounds quite sinister.
And equal access to education as well, making sure that girls and women can progress through the education system as far as they want to do and are supported and funded to do that, is one of the best ways that you can empower women to choose how many children they
We
want.
need to say, and of course, in this context, that how you come to the conclusion that I guess you're thinking per head that the UK has a bigger carbon footprint than China is quite significantly, that statement is not true.
Per head, yeah.
Per head, you didn't say per head at the time, but the reality is in the Western world, we've cut carbon emissions more than anybody. We lead the world in this. We have an incredibly effective carbon reduction policy
from
and
a very
implementation
high
over
base,
the last
though.
few years. And ultimately, although people like to come and protest about how we don't do anything, we've done more than arguably any other developed country in the world at tackling this.
Only
in the
behind
world
Sweden.
Indeed. So we do a pretty good job, frankly, and I think Alys is right that actually the way to manage it will be through research and innovation and technology, clean and renewable energy. We've got some amazing projects and research, again, that we lead the world in. Fusion in my part of the world, hugely exciting project. There's all sorts that we're really good at. Modular reactors in Derby, hydrogen at Toyota, we've got loads going on. And investing, I think we'll probably see tomorrow, investment zones built around clean energy and renewables and trying to do that clean growth bit that ultimately is going to be what reduces carbon emissions. It's not going to be telling people they can't get in the car anymore.
From one Ben to another, Ben Lake.
I only have to add, that I think that the key point here is the consumption that every one of us has, and I don't think that's solved necessarily by population policy. I would agree with Alys, actually, that if there is a concern here about areas of the world, countries of the world that are growing rapidly, I think that the key there is to ensure that women have choice, and that, yes, means investment in healthcare, it means access to family control, and also education. And I don't think ultimately we need to get down that sort of rabbit hole of population control or even depopulation, because I agree it does sound quite sinister, and I think we can achieve our decarbonisation aims by other means, and we don't really need to worry too much about the population.
Right, we'll come back to more questions in a moment. It's 8:43.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:45. Carla Denyer, Ben Bradley, Ben Lake and Alys Denby with us answering your questions. Robbie's in Chelmsford. Hi, Robbie.
Evening all. The question is, yesterday the Young Conservative Network issued a statement effectively citing they were closing down because of a lack of ambitious policies for young people in the Conservative Party and factional divides. Is this another indicator that the Tories don't have a future?
Now, the Young Conservative Network is indeed shutting down and criticising Tory policy on issues such as housing, but this is not the official Young Conservatives branch. They are not shutting down. Now, I've never heard of the Young Conservative Network. Is it more than 3 teenagers and a dog, Ben Bradley?
Well, I'd never heard of it until yesterday when I heard it was shutting down either. And bear in mind, I was the party's vice chairman for youth who set up the Young Conservatives. You would think that I would have if it was massively influential.
So it's basically not the People's Front of Judea, but the Judean People's Front.
It's one of those. It is a good thing that there are lots of very keen young people who want to engage in a kind of grassroots way and want to set things up and have a voice. And I always support that. I think that's really important. Sometimes people get fed up and decide they don't want to do it anymore. I don't think it's a massive indicator of the future of Conservative politics, if I'm honest.
Now, as a young Conservative, Alys Denby, have you ever heard of it?
Thank you very much for calling me young. I think technically as a Conservative voter, I think the average age is something like 51, so I think I am
Which is actually less than an average Labour voter. Did you know that?
Is it?
Yeah.
These days.
Apparently.
Oh, there you go. No, I think the Conservative Party does have a massive young person problem. I think the failure over, decades to build enough houses has been a real betrayal of the whole concept of a home-owning democracy. All the things that make people Conservative, owning your own home, starting family, having a stake in community, are being denied to young people. I think the Conservative Party has a massive problem. If you talk to young Conservatives, they're extremely radical, they're extremely angry and pretty right-wing. But I would say to your listeners and to any Conservative MPs or policymakers listening that the Centre for Policy Studies just brought out an essay collection titled Justice for the Young, which contains many brilliant ideas for how we can resolve what is, I think, one of the most fundamental challenges in politics, which is, the increasing gerontocracy of our society. And
did I read today that David Frost, Lord Frost, is going to be heading up the Centre for Policy Studies in future?
He's not heading it up, he is doing a research project for us. So it's revisiting the Stepping Stones project that kind of launched the Thatcher Revolution. So for our 50th anniversary, he's going to be doing a modernisation of that.
The John Hoskins of our time. And most people won't get that illusion, but I know you will, despite your youth. Ben Lake.
Well, I have to say I'm not very familiar with the internal workings of the Conservative Party, and so I'm not sure what this network was and how many people are members of it and what have you. But to the point about the disillusionment of young people and the younger generations in this country with sort of the day-to-day political debate, I think that's quite clear. You speak to young people in schools, in universities, in colleges. There is a lot of apathy out there, and there is this kind of belief that what does politics to offer us? And if I can perhaps just make a bit of a broader point, that's quite dangerous. In a society, we need every single generation to have a stake in it, as you mentioned, Alys, and to believe that there is worth in participating and engaging in the democratic process. And I do worry, that there are sections of young people in particular who feel so disillusioned that they are then turning to the extremes. They are looking to more radical solutions, and sometimes those radical solutions can be quite sinister. And it's definitely seeing that.
But that's enough about the Green Party.
How very dare you.
Joke, Carla, joke.
Is that your way of coming to me?
Yes. Didn't really work, did it?
No. Well, I've got a question, first of all, as long as that doesn't mean I lose the mic, which is, what's the upper age limit for the Young Conservatives?
So when I left, I think it was 25, but that was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. So it's quite a low bracket.
I'd heard a rumour it was really high, but it's not actually. Okay. Well, Young Greens...
That's scuppered you.
Yeah, it has. So the Young Greens, which is all members of the Green Party who are under 30 or in full-time education, is, I think, in contrast, by the sound of it, to at least some parts of the Young Conservatives, growing really rapidly, and we're getting loads of Young Greens elected. We've got... 2, I think. It depends on when someone's birthday is. In Bristol, in my councillor group. Loads nationally. And part of the reason for that is that Young Greens as a group is really, really big. We're the largest youth movement in a UK political party and really active. So they run brilliant political kind of education and mentoring programmes. There's one of them called 30 Under 30, which I'm a graduate of, and I would plug it, but applications have just closed. And the Young Greens are also really good at mobilising around getting their members elected. So whenever there's Young Greens standing for election, whether it's council election or a parliamentary or London Assembly, they will organise a massive action day, and there'll be young Greens coming from all over the country to get
How old
their...
were you when you first joined the Green Party?
I was in my mid-20s when I joined, and I got elected as a councillor when I was 29, so I was just a young Green. And I went on the Young Greens 30 Under 30 programme in my first year as a councillor, which was in the kind of 9 months or so leading up to the Brexit vote. So at the time, our 30 Under 30 programme included a trip to Brussels where half of the cohort decided we were going to be MEPs. And then our hearts were broken, alas.
Right, okay, let's move on from this. Robbie, thank you very much for that. A text question from Beth in Wrexham. What's the point of the COVID inquiry? Is it giving us anything other than tittle-tattle and rude words? Now, Professor Sir Chris Whitty told the inquiry today that the UK pandemic preparations were not even up to scratch for dealing with a flu pandemic, let alone COVID. Well, as Beth is from Wrexham, Ben, I'm coming to you first.
Well, I have to say that the whole, however many weeks now of public oral sessions, it's been completely unedifying for the entire government and just the state, really. And I have a lot of sympathy with those who complain about, well, we're just getting tittle-tattle, gossip, and a part of me, it does sort of cringe at the way that some politicians and civil servants have been talking about each other during the height of the COVID pandemic. What I would say from a Welsh perspective, of course, is that Wales is only a minor part of this COVID inquiry, and the Welsh Government actually declined the opportunity to really have its own inquiry to show its own workings and how it operated during the pandemic. And so I fear that many of the lessons that might be learnt on a UK level won't be in Wales, because we don't have that level of scrutiny and transparency. So in terms of the short answer to that question,
what you're saying is you want to read Mark Drakeford's WhatsApp messages. That's what you're saying, isn't it? Wouldn't we all?
Yeah, I'm sure we'd have quite a few interesting snippets from the Welsh Cabinet. But I think on paper, in theory, there is a value to an inquiry, especially when we consider some of the rather significant measures that the government and the state had to take over the past few years, the way in which it intervened into people's lives. I think it's right that we have that sort of process of looking at it and making sure
Alys.
that's right.
I think this inquiry is asking the completely wrong questions. I think it's spending far too much time looking at the decision-making process. We know all this stuff. Flawed people, bad leaders made terrible decisions. People didn't know what they were doing and they were panicking. The real question, if we want to have anything to go for in the future, is what were the effects of lockdown? Should we ever do it again? And the inquiry just isn't looking at that. It's asking the wrong questions, and it's just an expensive exercise in, as you say, raking over people's WhatsApps.
And it seems from the evidence sessions I've seen that politicians bad, civil servants good, Carla. That seems to be the conclusion that they're drawing.
Well, I'm going to perhaps unpopularly stick up for the idea of an inquiry. Exactly as Ben was saying, I do think it's really important that we learn from mistakes that were made by government. And it seems to me that one of the big themes of what's come out this week is government ministers having a pretty poor grasp of the scientific advice they're being given and not making it evidence-based policy decisions. And so it is important that we learn from those mistakes. I guess as an engineer, so with a scientific background that's now trying to get elected as an MP, I would say that. But I do think that having more people from all walks of life and backgrounds and experience in politics is a positive for reasons like that, so that you can have people who've got a good grasp of the science. And also, as was pointed out earlier in the inquiry, there was not a single person in the cabinet that had ever been on free school meals. There were not very many women in the decision-making positions around the early stages of COVID, especially. And one of the things that was highlighted in relation to that was the problem with PPE that nurses were being expected to wear, not fitting most women's faces and bodies. And perhaps if there'd been more women in the room, perhaps
not sure the cabinet decided about the fit of particular PPE.
Of course, they don't make day-to-day operational decisions, but they were receiving reports of those problems. And I feel like if there had been a wider diversity of people in the room, they may have received those reports, taken them a little bit more seriously.
Ben?
Okay, sorry.
I'm not even going to get into that. Some of that is not quite sure. I think I agree with Alys in the sense of I think they're asking the wrong questions. I think it's really frustrating that societally, right, to a certain extent, we're all to blame. I think we would rather have a soap opera than a fact-based and useful mission in some of this. I actually feel quite sorry for a number of people who are typically behind the scenes, like Chris Whitty, who are never asked to be thrown into that position, to have what are meant to be private messages raked through in the public eye. It's not fair, is it? And we all say things in a private WhatsApp. You've had a difficult day and whatever, you send a message that says, well, this guy's or whatever. It was never meant for public consumption, is it? And if you can't privately, as politicians in particular, because you've got to investigate the science, you've got to challenge, that's your job, to say things like, what about if we tried X? Might turn out to be a stupid idea, but you've got to be able to ask the question, and you've got to be able to trust that you can do that in an environment where you're not going to get slated for raising ideas and things later on. And actually, I think it could be quite damaging if you end up going through these things in the future, having not particularly learned the lessons of what worked and what didn't work and what the impacts were, which is what they should be about. And you end up in a place where just nobody in the decision-making room can ask the question that's in their brain because they're worried about what it's going to look like when it comes out.
I'm going to move on because I'm going to fit one more question in, and it's from Sean in Bristol. It's a text question. After Argentina elected a far-right outsider as their new president, prompting praise from Trump and Bolsonaro, should I fear another rise of dangerous authoritarian leaders around the world? Well, I spent the weekend writing an essay about General Galtieri of Argentina during the Falklands War, so it's quite an interesting question, this one. Now, this populist candidate, former economist Javier Milei, has won Argentina's election, vowing to make huge public sector cuts to the extent that he carried a chainsaw around at some of his campaign appearances. There's an idea for you, Ben. While Trump and Bolsonaro both hailed his victory, he also tweeted that he expected them both to win. Right, you've each got about 30 seconds on this one. Alice?
Okay, I'm not sure I'd necessarily call him far right. I think he's a fan of Margaret Thatcher who wants to cut back the state. I think we're going to have we're going to see in real time how effective these kind of radical libertarian policies are going to be, which is going to be very interesting for people like me who work for free market think tanks.
So you've got an open mind.
Open mind.
Ben Lake?
I think that given what's happened to the Argentinian economy in the last year or so, I'm not that surprised that people have decided to go quite radical, and in this case, with this gentleman. I think it's a lesson for those of us who consider ourselves progressive parties to show leadership on some of the biggest issues of the day, and if you don't provide a policy platform that offers people hope, they will go elsewhere.
Because his opponent was the economics minister who's presided over an inflation rate of 150%, so it's hardly surprising that he lost, I suppose. Carla?
Well, I agree with Ben Lake that, and Sean is right to be concerned. I don't think that the world is necessarily through this patch of right-wing populist politicians rising to power. But rather than confronting that possibility with fear, I'm determined to confront it with hope and with solutions and with organising to present a positive alternative and persuading people to vote for it.
Great. A question on Argentina. You managed to get it round to Green Party election prospects. I'm in awe of you. Ben?
Very impressive, isn't it? Look, I'm no expert in Argentina at all, but I come at these things in the same way as Alice described. I'm always a little bit conscious when people describe people as right-wing or far-right, that actually very often, kind of general consensus among my constituents that they're probably right about lots of things. I have not followed the election closely, but I'll be interested to see, as you say,
well, he wants to cut the number of government departments from 18 to 8.
Sounds very wise.
Maybe that could be something that Rishi Sunak...
I wonder if the lesson, as Ben described, is that if you don't, from a right-of-centre party perspective, if you don't tackle some of these challenges about things like the size of the state and some of the things that do concern people, some of the frustration with our general politics, then people will go for somebody who promises to do it in a radical way. Maybe a lesson for the Prime Minister there.
Right, our final question is from Dave in Winchester. Top Gear is staying off the TV for some time to come after Freddie Flintoff's horrible accident. But if it eventually comes back with you as one of the hosts, where in the world would you like to travel around to do one of their big travel challenges and drive very fast cars? I'm sure, Carla Denyer, that is what you would love to do, even though you can't admit it.
Electric cars.
I'm pretty sure Top Gear already did one with electric cars to see how far they could get, didn't they? A few years ago now. But nevertheless,
the answer is not very far.
Nevertheless, that's my suggestion. On the contrary, the range of modern electric cars is getting really, really good now. But I think that's what it would be. It would be to go somewhere.
Your nose has just got so much longer.
It's a good job because there's no charges that work.
Well, I was going to say, I think the it would be good fun to go somewhere, a more remote part of the world, and see how far you can get on modern electric vehicles.
Good luck with that, Ben.
I always enjoy the ones where they're doing something daft like Stevenage to Donington or something really exotic, and then James May has to cycle the last 10 miles because his fanger's broken down. So I would stay local. They did one in Mansfield once, actually, and ironically, really? Freddie Flintoff...
Low-budget series, that one.
was, and Freddie Flintoff crashed into the marketplace. I don't think we've ever had compensation for our local damage, so that's my first port of call if given a job.
Ben Lake.
Well, I'm a big rugby man, and so I'd probably do a tour of the stadia, the Six Nations teams and countries. So I'll go from one to the other, make a bit of an epic tour.
I don't think I can feel Carla sort of praying at that one. Alys?
I can't drive, so...
That would be a challenge, wouldn't it?
Well, I think what I would try and do is...
It'd be fun, though, to watch, wouldn't it?
This is what I think I would do. I think I'd go around the north of England, or maybe even your constituency, try and get around on public transport, which I think would be both hilarious, but perhaps also do a useful job of highlighting how poor some of our infrastructure is in some of the areas that need it the most.
Well, thank you all for coming on the show tonight. Ben Bradley, Carla Denyer, Alys Denby and Ben Lake. On tomorrow's Cross Question, we have the Liberal Democrats housing spokesperson Helen Morgan, the Conservative MP Duncan Baker, the Imam and broadcaster Ajmal Masroor, and on the day of the autumn statement, the economist Dr. Linda Yu, one of my favourite people. Also, Rachel Reeves will be here to take your calls from 7 o'clock tomorrow evening as well. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk about protests. Not the ones that you've been reading about over the past few weeks, but ministers have been accused of kicking plans for protest buffer zones around abortion clinics into the long grass after it was announced they would not be implemented until next spring. I want to talk more generally about this. Can it be right to ban peaceful protests outside abortion clinics? Or do you think this is such a sensitive issue, and given the traumas that many women will be suffering as they go into these clinics, that it's just outrageous that anybody should want to add to their traumas? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, police in North Wales say the car in which they found the bodies of 4 missing teenage boys was upside down and partially submerged in water. They'd failed to return home from a camping trip in Snowdonia. LBC's Thomas Davies reports.
This follows an extensive search by not just North Wales Police, but several other members of the emergency services over the last 24 hours or so, from the Coast Guard to the air ambulance to the regular ambulance service, even to the mountain rescue teams, which are often very busy in this part of the world in Eryri National Park.
It's thought a deal may have been struck between Israel and Hamas for the release of around 50 hostages who were taken during the October the 7th attack. Israel's Prime Minister summoned his war cabinet, security cabinet and his government for meetings this evening, 3 groups which need to approve any deal. Benjamin Netanyahu says real progress has been made in Qatar. Detectives who investigated the disappearance of Nicola Bulley in Lancashire have been criticised for failing to curb people speculating about the case. She died after falling in the River Wyre earlier this year. Lancashire Police and Crime Commissioner Andrew Snowden says some comments online made the investigation harder.
When the police lose control of the narrative with the mainstream media, that fuels social media speculation, and some of the social media speculation was abhorrent that went on and was incredibly damaging and hurtful to many, many people.
The review has found the overall missing persons operation was well handled. TV presenter and actress Annabelle Giles has died after being diagnosed with a brain tumour. Her children have described it as one of a kind. And the King and Queen have welcomed South Korea's president to Buckingham Palace this evening for a state dinner.
It is a partnership in which close personal connections, fostered over many decades, have blossomed today into